Ah, tá. Okay, so I see that we are now officially on, so I guess we can start it. I'd like to wish a good afternoon to our Brazilian colleagues, to all our colleagues from South America, a good evening to Professor Lisa Herzog, or even a good morning, depending on which different time zone the attendees are watching us. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of our colleagues here today and to open this first web seminar on the subject Hegel and Politics, New Perspectives. This is the first of a series of web seminars organized around our journal, our philosophy journal, Hegel Studies, here from Brazil, the journal Revista Eletrônica Estudos Hegelianos, and more specifically, the seminars are based on the two last issues of Hegel Studies, the issues we called Hegel and Politics, New Perspectives, and that were published from 2018 on. So the idea of these web seminars is to promote and to discuss the works and the studies about Hegel's political philosophy made by scholars from all over the world and who publish their works in our journal. Today we have with us Professor Lisa Herzog, and for the next months until the end of the year, we will also be able to welcome other professors such as Professor Norbert Vazek, Professor Frank Ruda, Professor Paulo Arantes. And the exact dates of our next seminars you can find soon on our Facebook page and also on the internet page of the journal Hegel Studies. I also need to mention that these seminars are being organized by my colleagues, the editors of the issues Hegel and Politics, who are also present here today. So we have in this kind of backstage Emmanuel Nakamura. I will ask him to make a quick introduction of himself so that all of our colleagues can see you. Manu.
Yes. My name is Emmanuel Nakamura. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University from Campinas, Unicamp, and I would like to thank Lisa for accepting the invitation and to thank Poliana for all the organization for this event.
Thank you, Manu. Also, as a member of the organizing committee, we have Professor Ricardo Criciúma here with us. Ricardo, if you can make a quick introduction of yourself. You have your microphone enabled. You need to enable.
Now I think that is okay. So good afternoon all. I am also a professor here in Porto Alegre, but actually in the URGS, University of Rio Grande do Sul. I am professor of political philosophy, and I am also an editor of the online Hegelian studies here of Brazil. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Lisa and have you all here to this first lecture of our cycle on Hegel and Politics.
Thanks, Ricardo. Also, as a member of the organizing committee here with us, Professor Inácio Helfer. Inácio.
Okay, I am Inácio Helfer, and I work at Unicinos, University Unicinos at São Leopoldo, and I work with Hegel politic philosophy, and it's very, very good here. Thank you.
Great. We have also another member of the organizing committee, Professor Fábio Nolasco. He is professor at UNB, Universidade de Brasília, and unfortunately he couldn't be here with us today, but he will certainly be here for the next ones. I also would like to mention that we have the very important support of our Hegel's working group, GT Hegel in ANPOF. This is the National Association of Philosophy Research, and also the support of Hegel's Brazilian Society. So I'd like to thank them for backing us up on this idea. And I couldn't fail to mention, in behalf of all the members of the organizing committee, that we also would like to dedicate this seminar to the memory of Professor Marx Müller, who unfortunately passed away last week, and who left a priceless contribution to Brazilian philosophy, and especially to the academic studies on Hegel and Marx. So before I give the floor to our guest professor today, Professor Herzog, I'd like to give a quick explanation about how this seminar is going to work, and about some technical questions around it. First, I will hand over to Professor Herzog, who will have up to 45 minutes to do her presentation, her exposition, and after that, I will make the first intervention, and I will ask a few questions, open the debate, and then we will open to the other questions of the attendees who joined us here through the platform Teams. So the attendees can write down their questions anytime. We ask you to write your questions in English and through the feature chat here from the Teams platform. For those who are using Teams for the first time, you need to enable the feature chat. It's right below the screen on the toolbar with the button with a question mark symbol. So you just need to touch on this button, and then you will be able to ask your question. In case there are participants who joined us anonymously, I'd like to ask them to identify themselves in case they want to ask a question, just informing their name, and also, if it is the case, if it's possible, also to inform the university to which they belong to. After Professor Herzog's presentation, we will gather and organize the questions and then forward it to her. A last important technical point for those who could be interested: we are providing certificates for the seminars. So for those who want it, you just have to fill in the form at the link which Andressa will make available in the chat here in Teams. I think now we can finally move on to the seminar itself. So today, as I said, we have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Lisa Herzog. She's a professor at the Center for Philosophy, Politics and Economics of Groningen University in the Netherlands. Her research themes lie in the intersection of political philosophy and economics. She authored a large number of works, so I will limit myself to name just a few. Among others, she published Inventing the Market, Smith, Hegel and Political Theory from 2013. In German, Freiheit gehört nicht nur den Reichen, 2014. And more recently, in 2019, she published, also in German, Politische Philosophie and Die Rettung der Arbeit, ein politischer Aufruf. We also translated one of her texts to the last issue of Estudos Hegelianos, the Hegel Studies, the text Two Ways of Taming the Market, published originally in 2015 as a chapter of the collection Hegel and Capitalism. It was published by Andrew Buchwalter and Sunny Press, who were very kind to allow us the translation. So after this introduction, I'd like to once more to thank and to give the floor to Professor Lisa Herzog.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, so I will start sharing my screen. So I have some slides, and I'll talk through the paper, and then I look very much forward to the discussion with you. So, let me see now. Do you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it. It's not in presentation mode.
Yes, I'll do that. Hang on. Now it should be.
Yes, perfect.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So this paper, Two Ways of Taming the Market, started in around 2008 when the great financial crisis happened, and philosophers who usually worked on all kinds of other topics turned to questions about the economy, including Hegel scholars. And of course, there are many questions one can then ask. Can we understand the passages in Hegel that are about the economy and make sense of them today? Hegel is often perceived as a thinker of the state, not so much the economy. So does it make sense to read him with questions about the economy in mind? What did he actually know about economic thinking in his day? And can we gain anything from looking at Hegel when our questions are also about the economy? And in this paper, I discuss some aspects where I think one can actually find some quite interesting insights, which help to sort of correct a certain one-sided picture that many economists in particular have of human behavior. So I will focus on the late Hegel, the Hegel of the philosophy of right, which he published in 1820 and 21. And there he has this long section about civil society. And he says this is the realm where modern society grants individuals subjective freedom and particularity. So individuals can indulge themselves in all directions to satisfy their needs or their contingent arbitrary will, their subjective caprice, as he says. And then individuals encounter one another in instrumental relationships where they pursue their own interests. But it all happens within a framework of positive law, and everyone can do what they like. And you get this sphere that looks very chaotic with lots of contingent circumstances, as he says. And yet there are some sort of structures in this. So for Hegel, the market economy, which he sees as a distinctive element of modern in contrast to ancient society, is both potentially destabilizing and yet also to be welcomed because of its effects for subjective freedom. But he's also very critical because it leads to social inequality. He says it affords a spectacle of extravagance and misery, so it drives society apart. It leads to certain forms of corruption. And in the end, it can only be part of a society if it is superseded by the political sphere, the sphere of the state, which comes after the realm of civil society in the architecture of the philosophy of right. But already in the realm of civil society, there are these two institutions that Hegel sees as necessary institutions for taming and sort of embedding the market. And Hegel calls them, on the one hand, the police, and on the other hand, the corporations. And he describes both of them as elements of what he calls the external state, or the state of necessity, and the state of understanding. So in this paper, I will go and look at these two ways in which Hegel thinks markets can be tamed and embedded. First, I will look at this role of the police and see how Hegel thinks that the laws of the market can be sort of directed and partly embedded by the role of the police. And that's what I call, for simplicity, the economic perspective on human behavior. But then he also has the corporations. And here, again, for simplicity, I will talk about the sociological perspective that he also takes on. And I will argue that although he took up some economic insights of his time, with a sociological perspective, he really went beyond many other thinkers of his day who thought about economic issues. And there is a nucleus of a theory here about how preferences and identities are shaped in the social realms that arise in a modern economy. And in the conclusion, I will then show that these two models are still present in modern approaches to economic ethics. I'll focus on a few German thinkers, but I think one can also generalize this point. And I think that it's very fruitful to focus in particular on the second, the sociological perspective. And if there is some time left, or if you're interested in this in the discussion, I can say a bit more about how this has led me to thinking and writing about workplace democracy via a few other steps. But it started with thinking about Hegel and the corporations for me. So first, Hegel and the laws of the market. So I have a picture here, some planets, and that's because Hegel compares the laws of the market to the planet. So he says, when you look at this system of needs, the free market, we are first very confused, and it seems a sphere in which individuals just do what they want. Everyone has their particular preferences and wishes. And at first sight, it seems incredible that one can find any kind of regularity in this realm. But then he says, in these irregular movements of the market, we can compare this to the irregular movements that the planets seem to offer the human eye from the perspective of a human astronomer. But it's only apparent chaos because in reality there is some kind of regularity here. And I here have a long quote, but I think it's worth reading this out because it really contains some of the core messages here that of how Hegel viewed the market and the way in which economists at his time had thought about it. So here is the quote. Political economy is the science which starts from this view of needs and labor, but then has the task of explaining mass relationships and mass movements in their complexity and their qualitative and quantitative character. This is one of the sciences which have arisen out of the conditions of the modern world. Its development affords the interesting spectacle, as in Smith, Say, and Ricardo, of thought working upon the endless mass of details, which confront it at the outset and extracting therefrom the simple principles of the thing, the understanding effective in the thing and directing it. So I'll try to unpack what Hegel is doing here and connect this to the other thinkers that he here mentions, Smith, Say, and Ricardo. We know from Hegel's biography that he had already taken active interest in economic questions pretty early in his intellectual career. When he was a private teacher in Bern, he was in the library there. But it seems that he hasn't really read these other thinkers in a lot of detail. And we don't really know whether he read them in the original or whether he might have read them just through literature reviews or other sources. So I'll take these different people and go through some of the central messages of their theories, and then I'll compare that to what Hegel actually does. So first, Adam Smith here. As you probably all know, Smith is often considered the founding father of economics. He was originally a moral philosopher, and he is much more complex and much more interesting than the cliche that is still prevalent today. But Hegel actually had a sort of pretty stereotypical and cliched view of Adam Smith. So from Smith, Hegel adopts this idea that markets can coordinate human behavior and that in them quote, subjective selfishness turns into a contribution towards the satisfaction of the needs of everyone else. That's what in Adam Smith, in 2 passages, is described by the metaphor of the invisible hand, this idea that the market directs individual self-interest towards the public good through this invisible hand. I mean, Smith is actually pretty cautious and uses it only twice in the thousands of pages he has written, but this metaphor is such a, you know, strong picture that it took on a life on its own. And Hegel sort of seems to adopt it. He also takes on another central idea from Adam Smith, namely that the division of labor can really increase productivity. And there's this famous example, which you find in Adam Smith, but already before Smith in the Encyclopédie and in other texts of the 18th century, of the pin factory. And if one person tries to make pins from iron, that's very inefficient. But if a few people divide the work among themselves, they can produce lots and lots of pins. That was sort of the standard 18th century example for division of labor. So that's also something that Hegel takes on, but he doesn't take on all the other ideas that one also finds in Adam Smith. So Smith was pretty convinced, with some qualifications, that markets on the whole should be left to their own device and will self-regulate. So they will always find an equilibrium. Hegel does not quite believe this, and he doesn't believe that the price mechanism, which is so central in Smith, will lead to an automatic equilibrium. And in one of the Griesheim lectures, one of these set of lecture notes that we have from the lectures he gave roughly around the time when he was also working on the philosophy of right, he actually explicitly mentions bakers and brewers, and that's probably an allusion to Smith's famous quote about how we get our dinner from the self-interest of the baker, butcher, and brewer. So Hegel seems to be quoting Smith here, but he goes in a different direction, because he says that it was not a good idea when the price for groceries in England was left to self-regulate without any state regulation. And he remains skeptical about this argument. Also, in Adam Smith, a central argument is that labor markets should be flexible. Everyone should be allowed to work in whatever way they want. It's a very anti-feudalist attitude in Smith, and Hegel is pretty skeptical about this. And as I'll discuss later, he is in favor of regulating labor markets through the corporations. And also the way in which Adam Smith distinguishes different classes in society is a very sort of analytic view. So there are those who are producers, there are capital owners, and there are workers. Whereas Hegel has a very traditionalist view of the different social classes. So there's agriculture, and then there's trade, and then people working for the state. So it's a much more, if you like, phenomenological and not so analytic view of different classes. And finally, and that's probably the most important difference between the two here, Smith thought that if you let the free market do its work, there will be a more or less peaceful process of economic growth that will lead to the end of poverty. Everyone will benefit, even the poorest worker will have a growing standard of living. So it's, if you like, the sort of this optimistic story that if the economy is doing its work, everyone will benefit. And Hegel doesn't buy that. And he thinks that there will be more and more conflict, there will be class division, there will be a rabble of people who fall out of the regular labor process. So he's very skeptical, and he sometimes uses metaphors that are much closer to a sort of Hobbesian state of nature. So a war of all against all, a field of conflict. In one place he says, this economic realm is like the remnants of the state of nature. Everyone does what they want, no order, and so on. So he doesn't really buy this invisible hand story from Adam Smith. Now, when we look at Jean-Baptiste Say and David Ricardo, the other two names that Smith mentions, There is less to be said here because he really doesn't discuss in any detail their central writings. Say is famous for what is today called Say's law. And here the idea is that supply creates its own demand. So if someone starts a company and they start to produce something, then the question is, can they sell these goods to someone who is going to come up with the demand for these new goods? And Say had an argument that, okay, these people who start the company, they need to employ others, so they will pay them wages, and then somehow the wages will filter through the economic system, and in the end there will be enough demand for all the new supply. And that's, again, in a way, one of these arguments about how markets are self-regulating and self-stabilizing. And we simply don't find anything like that in Hegel's writings. And on the contrary, we do find some hints that he might have been influenced by thinkers who were more critical of Say, and who pointed out that when not all of this new income is used for consumption, if some people hoard it instead, then we won't get this natural or automatic balance of Say's law. And that's something that he might have gotten from James Stewart, another economist who's mostly forgotten today, who was also much more critical of Say's law. With regard to Ricardo, it's also not clear where exactly Hegel would have taken up arguments from him. Two of the central arguments in Ricardo are about the accumulation of capital and how that is, in the long run, more or less beneficial, and about the effects of different kinds of taxes. And I haven't got this on the slides, but one could also mention Ricardo's views about foreign trade always being beneficial. That's also not Hegel's position at all. So Hegel says that there are these economic laws, but he doesn't really take up all the arguments that the early economists of his day had made. And when one asks oneself, well, why is this? Why does he say, well, we should look at these thinkers who see some order in this chaos, and at the same time he doesn't really believe it? I think it's quite helpful to turn to this notion that he uses of economics being a science of the understanding. And of course, there are lots of questions about what Hegel means by understanding. And I won't go into all the details here. But one central point about understanding, in contrast to reason, is that understanding tends to take certain things as giving and hold certain things fixed, whereas reason is this capacity to challenge everything and to recognize that things are contingent, not to just accept the premises. The kind of understanding that economics as a science uses, I think, is that it leaves certain things fixed and doesn't question them. And one of these things is people's preferences and the features of their individual character, their upbringing, their culture, that determine what they will actually do when they enter this economic realm. So Hegel says all the time, oh, in the economic realm, everyone can do what they want. But he doesn't ask, at least not in this part, well, where do these things that people want come from? And that is something that later economists have also sort of done. Because they've assumed that, well, all people want to better their condition, as Smith calls this in one place. Or in John Stuart Mill later on, he says, well, we can focus on the consequences of the pursuit of wealth. And he just assumes that human beings are pursuing wealth. So we take this as given, and then we try to explore what the consequences are. And modern economic approaches that use rational choice theory do basically the same thing. And in a way, this is a very static picture of what human beings are. We make certain assumptions about human nature, and then we hold these fixed, and then we try to figure out what the consequences are. And of course, economists always like to say, well, it's just methodological assumptions. But of course, those are very powerful economic assumptions, and arguably, but I'm just saying this in brackets here, they also had a sort of performative cultural effect on how the economy has then actually functioned. So what does this mean for thinking about markets? When we take human preferences as fixed and we ask, well, how can we tame markets? So the scheme for this is on this next slide. So we take human preferences as given. For example, everyone wants to earn more money, or everyone wants to minimize their labor time. These are all very basic, sort of static assumptions. And then we ask how the rules and incentives of the system can be adapted such that given these human preferences, certain results will come out of it. And I put this picture here. I don't know whether you know these kinds of flipper games where you have little balls and then you have a structure around them. And I mean, there are different versions of this, but then you have the laws of gravity and you shoot these little balls up and then they follow the laws of gravity, and you can try to guide them in a certain direction by using these different levers of the framework. And that's sort of a metaphor for how this perspective on the economic system functions. We assume human beings are like these little balls driven by very simple preferences. We can always predict what they will do. And what matters is that we set the rules and we create that kind of framework that gives us the results that we want. And in Hegel, that's more or less what the police does. So he says the police is the universal which acts with regard to civil society. And it has two tasks. The first is to remove contingencies which interfere with this or that end, and to attain undisturbed security of persons and property. And then the second aim is to realize the right of individuals to livelihood and welfare, so to fight the extreme forms of poverty. And the measures that the police can take in Hegel include market surveillance, the arbitration of disputes, oversight of industries, and sometimes in extraordinary circumstances, also fixing of prices for the common necessities of life. And I mean, that's more than what many economists in Hegel's time and also today would recommend, but it's the same kind of methodological approach in the sense that you have an external framework of legal rules and measures that can sort of guide all these economic forces in a certain direction. And Hegel also explicitly calls the police an external order. It doesn't really touch the inner lives of individuals. It doesn't make them think twice about their preferences. It doesn't change them in any way. So if one were to read Hegel only up to that point, one could think that, well, when it comes to the economic realm, he's sort of similar to what modern economists are also doing in terms of their methodology. But that's not all that he does. And I think that's the interesting point about Hegel having the police and the corporations as these two forces that can embed markets. So the second institution that Hegel has in order to tame markets are these corporations. And they're apparently some kind of professional associations of those who work in the same craft or in the same branch of some business. But in some places in lecture notes, he actually also talks about local communities as corporations. So it's sort of unclear what they actually are. And he very clearly says that he was not thinking of the old feudal guilds, which were these associations mostly of traders that were very rigid and mostly defending their own privileges. So he says, no, that's not what I want. But it sort of remains unclear how exactly he imagines these corporations to work. But they do appear in a critical point in the architecture of the philosophy of rights. They come at the very end of the section on civil society, just before he makes the transition into the part on the state. So we don't quite know how exactly these institutions are supposed to work, but they come at this really crucial point, so they must have been important for him. And I mean, in the secondary literature, there are lots of suggestions. He might have thought about institutions that had their origin in Roman law or medieval constitutionalism, but that doesn't actually really help us very much either. The second big puzzle is how these institutions are supposed to coexist with the free market that he talks about just a few paragraphs earlier in the text. Because it seems that he wants a free market with more or less free play of the market price and supply and demand for goods and services. But the corporations are sort of regulating the supply side, so the production side. And it's not quite clear how this can work. So for example, if you have a corporation of, let's say, shoemakers, and then another individual comes in and also wants to offer shoes in the market, who's going to win in the competition? Or is the corporation going to somehow adopt this new member? Is it going to be a mandatory membership in the corporation? But then what if, I don't know, we have the corporation of, in some industry where people just don't want the product anymore? And then what are these people supposed to do? Are they supposed to all jointly switch to a different industry? Or how is, this is all completely unclear how this is supposed to work. But I think that for Hegel, the corporations have a really interesting function, even though there are all these unclear elements, because they start opening up what remained fixed in the earlier discussions, namely the formation of human preferences. And preferences are, of course, coming out of people's general character or how they are formed. And you may know this infamous German term Bildung, which is at the same time sort of an ideal of education. You want to be a gebildete Person, so someone who's well-formed, but it also has a much more basic sort of biological meaning. So you could think about how a tree forms blossoms and then fruits, and that would also be described as a kind of building. So that's a notion that has sort of Aristotelian roots and that Hegel and other German idealists have used quite a lot. And I think the corporations are one of the places in Hegel's account of civil society where Bildung takes place. Not the only one, but an important one. Hegel emphasizes that in modern societies, people's preferences are not based on biological necessities alone. Those would in fact be fixed. You know, if it's just about getting a certain amount of calories to every human being, we have, you know, medical science, and we can give a pretty clear answer to that. But that's not how modern markets work. People want certain kinds of foods at certain times, prepared in a certain way. And Hegel is quite explicit that this is really different from the way in which animal preferences function. This is a specifically human thing, that our biological necessities are shaped into these various cultural forms. And he's also sort of positive about this, and he doesn't condemn it. He's not a Rousseauian in this sense. And so he's totally open and apparently doesn't care about the fact that humans get their ideas about what they want from their social environment. They see that someone else has something, they want the same thing. So imitation is an important part of what happens in civil society. And people also just adapt to the social traditions around themselves in questions of dress or he says times of meals, all these things, there are these conventions, and yeah, that's how we human beings functions. So that's a typically sociological perspective, if you like, because it really asks where people's preferences come from and where in the social context these influences act on individuals. There's a sort of a quip that economics is the science of how people choose, and sociology is about why they have no choice, because their social context determines what they actually want or what they will choose. And in that sense, Hegel is really taking a sociological perspective, because he really asks, well, how is it that people have all these different preferences? And by the way, the corporations here function together with the different classes that he describes. So he says people who work in agriculture as a class, they have a specific character, they have specific preferences, and so on. And the same for those who work in trade or in civil servants and so on. So he assumes that what people do and the kind of people that they cooperate with on a daily basis, that's how their character gets formed. And he is quite explicit that we need these kinds of communities. And I'll show you a quote now, what he says about a person who is not a member of such a corporation or social class, whatever, one of these communities. So he says, unless he is a member of an authorized corporation, an individual is without rank or dignity. His isolation reduces his business to mere self-seeking, and his livelihood and satisfaction become insecure. Consequently, he has to try to gain recognition for himself by giving external proofs of success in his business, and to these proofs, no limits can be set. And for anyone who knows a little bit about Hegel, if there can be no limits, that's a problem for him, because in his way of thinking, there always needs to be limits to something. And if there's something completely unlimited, that sort of explodes out of his system. So that's a sort of warning sign that there's something dangerous going on here. And in fact, commentators have taken up this passage and have argued that if someone is not a member of a corporation, then people will have an unlimited desire for ever more goods, because they don't get recognition and they have no sense of an appropriate level of consumption. And that's why they become these greedy, individualistic strivers for ever more gain, which economists assume is what all human beings are like. So Hegel is sort of saying that's a pathological case of someone who's not a member of a corporation. It's not the normal case. So what Hegel here looks at is really the question, how are people formed in the social context in which they live? And also, what kinds of solidarity do we see in these social contexts? He says about the corporations that they also have various support functions for individuals. So people care for each other in these corporations. And if someone falls into misery, for example, because some family member dies or something, then the others will take care of that person. So there's a sense of, if you like, a sort of proto-social insurance here as well. And that educates the members of the corporation in a kind of ethos of solidarity, which is different from the ethos of the state, but which is sort of preparing them by, being socialized in this more limited community where they can see all the others, can probably, interact with them on a regular basis. That already changes them, and they are not these egoistic, self-seeking creatures anymore. And that also explains why the corporations are in this position in the philosophy of right. That makes for the ideal transition towards the political state, where it's really about individuals as citoyens and not just as bourgeois. So really as a citizen in the sense of proud member of the political state. So where does this leave us if we take these two perspectives that Hegel describes in the police and the corporations? These two models are really two very different ways of thinking about how this play of forces in the free market can be tamed and embedded. The police model is the model that modern economics is also using. Change the incentive structures. Don't ask where people's preferences come from. Change what they have to pay for what, basically. So, for example, one approach to environmental ethics is to say, well, let's just make CO2 emissions super expensive, because then people will react to it. Then when they have to pay for it, they will adapt their behavior. Don't preach to them, just put a price on it. That would be a typical response from that kind of model. And I think in the case of environmental ethics and CO2 emissions, there's actually a lot to be said in favor of that approach if you make it a really high price. But it's one way of how to think about embedded markets. It's not the only one. And in the contemporary or sort of 90s and 2000s debate about economic ethics in the German context, it's quite interesting that there is one school of thinkers. Karl Hohmann was the first, and there are a number of others who really said, well, if you want to think about economic ethics, that's the approach we have to take. We have to create a better framework for markets. And he was very much influenced by institutional economics. And it's this picture of the police. The police has to set the framework such that what people do, what their preferences lead them to do, will lead to the right results. And then there is the other model of the corporations, where it's not about changing the framework, but if you like, changing people, changing their preferences, their behavior. And in economic ethics, there is a competing school. Peter Ulrich was the main thinker here, and a few others, who said, well, that's how we have to think about embedding markets. Don't just change the framework, actually create people with better preferences, convince them, have arguments with them. And he was very much influenced by Habermas and discourse ethics, and the idea that you can really convince people through different arguments and make them see new perspectives. And he emphasized what is called in business ethics the stakeholder approach, to have dialogues between different stakeholders of a company. Don't just go for what maximizes profits, but talk to each other, find solutions, change people's preferences and approaches to how they want to do business. The thing is that in Hegel, these two models are sort of apparently on the same level. He doesn't really say one is more important than the other. And of course, there's still the political state above everything. But he seems to have been clear that both approaches can play an important role for making sure that this chaotic play of forces in the market doesn't disrupt society too much. But if you look at today's perception of the history of ideas, there is quite an asymmetry here, because whenever one talks about embedding markets, people often instinctively think about the sort of Smithian approach, the economic approach, that you need external regulation of markets, if people want to regulate markets at all. I mean, something they are indeed self-regulating. I think that's an untenable position, but then the next best alternative for many is just to focus on external regulation. And it is, in a way, a misreading of Smith for reasons that I can't discuss here. It's a super simplistic picture, which often ends up being a kind of market absolutism, saying, well, all these human interventions are actually not a good idea. Let's just let markets do the work, and then the assumption is that somehow there will be good outcomes, which I think is really, really dangerous and pretty misguided. But I don't think I have to say more about this here. The question is whether, in addition to these external forms of regulating markets, we could also revive the kind of approach that is embedded in Hegel's picture of the corporations, which is focusing on the ethos and the sense of solidarity that can be created in certain institutions. And one interesting question is, of course, what is the role of workplaces? So if one agrees that in Hegel the corporations are in some way about the workplace, then the question from a modern perspective becomes, well, do workplaces prepare people for some kind of, today we would say, democratic citizenship, or do they teach them habits of submission or manipulation or whatever? And I mean, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. For me, the next question then is, well, how do we actually organize the workplaces that are the modern forms of the corporations? But in any case, the interesting lesson that we can here take from Hegel is to not only ask about the external regulation, but also ask, where do people's preferences actually come from, and how are they shaped by the institutions in which they work and which they encounter others in the economy? So I'll stop here, and I'll also stop sharing my screen, and I very much look forward to the discussion with you. You're still muted.
Yeah.
I think you're still muted.
Okay, now it's working.
Yeah.
Okay, it happens. Okay, so as I was saying, we would like to thank you very much for your excellent exposition, and to say again that it's a great pleasure having you here with us today. I'd like to formulate one or two questions to open the debate, and afterwards we can go to the questions of our attendees and of our colleagues here from the organizing committee. We have already a reaction on the chat. Jessica, the participant Jessica, is asking if you could make the material of the presentation, this PowerPoint presentation, somehow available to the attendees.
Yeah, I think that shouldn't be a problem. I think I sent you a version, so you can feel free to make it available. Yeah.
Okay. So I asked the ones that are interested in having this presentation material, you can just let your email address on the chat, and then I can forward the PowerPoint presentation for the ones who are interested. So as I say, I'd like to formulate one or two questions, initial questions. You made it very clear in your exposition that in Hegel's exam of these economic aspects of the civil society, he kind of refuses a merely economic view of the market, which, as you said, is still very modern nowadays, and which considers individual preferences as given, only influenced by a change in its institutional framework, or the external order, as you named it. And Hegel, he wants to emphasize the fact that people's choices are actually formed by their social context, or he argues that the corporation would shape these individuals in a more complete way, and hence these institutions would be crucial for the formation, for this Bildung of the individual's preferences and identities, and very important to Hegel for the development of an ethos that brings orders into civil society, and also secures the full ethos of the ulterior political citizenship. So you asked the question at the end of your presentation whether an economic ethos and the institutions that nurture it, whether it could be revived. And my first question goes in this direction. I'd like to know nowadays which institutions you think could play the role assumed by Hegel's corporations. And if it makes sense to say that there would exist institutions or initiatives which would represent at least these aspirations held by Hegel. And when I raise this question, I have particularly in mind nowadays initiatives such as the Manifest Democratizing Work, published in the beginning of the pandemic. So maybe this is something you would be able to explore in your comment, telling us whether, in your opinion, Hegel's ethical demands would have any common points with this kind of contemporary initiatives of civil society. And the second question, exploring more specifically the relationship between Hegel and Marx, I'd like to know from your point of view, how valid or how up-to-date would be Hegel's proposal regarding the challenges and the contradictions of capitalism and brought by capitalism, especially after Marx defends the thesis that we cannot expect to get rid of the capitalism contradictions simply through the intervention of institutions supposed to tame the market. So my second question would be, would Hegel's demands in strengthen certain institutions in civil society be enough to get rid of the most fundamental capitalism contradictions that lead to consequences such as poverty, as unemployment, precarious conditions of work, natural environment destruction, etc. So these would be my two initial questions.
Thank you. Those are huge questions, of course. Do stop me if I'm going on for too long here. I'll start with the second one. So on a Marxian picture, you could say that all this talk about the police and the corporation and then the political state in Hegel somehow taming or superseding markets, that's just misguided ideology, because all these political structures are just instruments in the hands of the capital owners. And therefore, they would never really tame markets. They would always do what capitalists want. And in that sense, there is no counterforce here. And I mean, of course, one could now distinguish between earlier Marx and later Marx and different readings, but I'll just take this as the basic picture here. And I think, in a way, Hegel's picture that it is possible to politically tame markets has proven partly correct, but only partly. And by partly correct, I mean that historically, especially in the last third of the 19th century and then again after World War II, in some countries, there were quite successful models of embedding markets in political structures where you did actually get a very generous, for the time, welfare state, where you did get labor law, occupational insurance, all these things that social democracy has fought for. So I think there were certain periods where the Hegelian picture was sort of plausible, and the Marxist picture that the state is really just in the hands of the capital ownership, that didn't seem correct, because there really did seem to be that counter movement where the labor movement, the unions, the socialist, the social democratic parties had this sort of political momentum to really embed markets. The question is whether that's still the case today or whether it was always an illusion. Some people think, and I have certain sympathies for that perspective, that the fact that this kind of taming was possible had to do with the conflict between the two big systems, capitalism and socialism, because capitalists were basically afraid that if they didn't make certain concessions, then there might be a revolution and the countries would go into socialism. And so the fact that you did have a socialist bloc had a sort of dampening effect on the power of capitalists. In today's situation, I think it has become much more difficult. There is no real sort of external alternative to capitalism. And the problem is that we have a globalized economy, and most political movements are still taking place on national or maybe sort of supranational but limited levels. And that makes it extremely difficult to tame markets in any way. I don't think that it's a hopeless cause. I think there are certain signs of hope, because there is really, or at least that's my perception. I'd be interested to hear your perception, but my perception is that people really don't believe in the neoliberal story any longer. So there is a search for alternative models. And the question is whether there could be new political coalitions that could form, that would revive these progressive coalitions that were really putting markets in their place and putting strong institutions in place that would actually supersede markets. So that's what I'm currently wondering. And I think, it's an open question, but, what's the alternative to trying and trying to get this going? And I think in a way, those who think that we should really get out of capitalism could still form allies with those who want to radically, reduce the scope of capitalism. So I think in the current situation, there could be a really broad political coalition on the left, if only the left didn't fall into infighting so often, to push back against this kind of market absolutism that is just, an ideology of the capitalist system, really. So that's my current position in a nutshell. And as I said, I'd be very interested to hear your positions. Now, on the other question, could there be institutions that take the role of the Hegelian corporations? I think definitely not what we call corporations these days, i.e. international or transnational big companies whose basic aim is to exploit workers. I mean, that I should have said this actually earlier. What he means by corporations is not corporations in the sense of, I don't know, Google or Walmart or something like that. I think that probably what the different functions of the corporations that he imagines are distributed onto different institutions, and it's also probably a bit different in different countries these days. So, for example, this social insurance function, in at least some countries, there is still some, government organized social welfare system, not as generous as we would like it to be, but there is some kind of safety net that's not done through the companies that people work for. But that doesn't have to be a huge problem if the other functions are then done by other institutions. I think that if workplaces were more democratic, they could, to some extent, be these kinds of associations where people learn a certain ethos, see that they don't have to strive for endless material goods, and receive some kind of building. I have a hard time imagining that when workplaces are completely hierarchical, with no opportunity for workers' voice, because these kinds of communities require openness and opportunities for people to engage in dialogue with others, because how would your preferences change if you can't exchange arguments with others? I don't think it can be just by watching what others do and sort of blindly imitating what they do. So, and that also draws a connection to the Democratizing Work Manifesto, because I think this was, I mean, it didn't mention Hegel or anything, but there's really a sense there that in order to re-embed capitalism and these global markets, we need to decommodify work, and we need to keep economic power in corporations in democratic check. And I mean, maybe your question was also on the level of the kinds of, the kind of movement, maybe movement is too much, but the kind of solidarity, let's say, among all the signatories of this manifesto. I mean, if you think about this as some kind of civil society activity, I think that civil society organizations can also be these kinds of spaces where people's character is formed, where they meet like-minded people, their preferences are shaped, and so on. So civil society is another important factor, I think. the problem, and that's the last point I want to make here, the problem with civil society organizations is, I think, that that's only a model that works for people who have the time and the energy to actually participate in these kinds of initiatives. But in many countries, you know, the less privileged have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to survive, and then they don't have time to, you know, go to meetings and or participate in civil society organizations in other forms. And that's why I think that the focus on the workplace is so important, because people are in their workplaces anyway, and they will be shaped by them. And if they are shaped in negative ways, that's a problem for democracy. But if they could be, you know, shaped there in positive ways, learning to be good democrats in their workplace, that could be a huge push for political democracy as well.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much for your reactions. We have also questions from the chat, and from someone who unfortunately didn't put his name or her name. The question is as follows: what are your position regarding the Marxist critique of this rehabilitation of an economic ethos of capitalism by authors like Honneth or Hegel?
Yeah, so if I understood it correctly, the question is my position on the Marxist critique of these commentators who take up the Hegelian model. So, and that of course means that it depends on how you read all the different people in the chain of argument. So let me maybe say something about Honneth first, because I know this a bit better than Rahel's work. So, I mean, if I take especially Freedom's Right, so Honneth's big book in which he sort of follows the structure of the philosophy of right, at least roughly, he has a picture there where he assumes that the economic realm can be one of positive social freedom in which we mutually reinforce one another in our freedom. So person A has a certain goal, and then person B supports person A in pursuing the goal. I mean, it's a sort of very harmonic story in which everyone can live with others peacefully. And that's something that I'm sort of skeptical about in Honneth. Now, I don't know whether that's the kind of Marxist critique that this person who asked the question meant here. I think that the economic realm is one in which we see conflicts of interest, we see stronger and weaker positions, and unless we have very strict regulation from the outside, but then potentially also through some kind of, you know, ethos on these 2 Hegelian models, I don't think the economic realm is going to be that kind of harmonic sphere very easily. I think it takes very, you know, strict regulation, maybe no market relations in certain areas that are today, you know, submitted to markets at all. I think, for example, healthcare and education should not be governed by market forces at all. And I think it takes a lot of political effort and a sort of constant, constant consciousness and alertness, because in the economic realm, there will be conflicts. And I think Hegel was totally right about this. And Honneth's picture, for me, is sort of too optimistic that all these conflicts will be solved on their own. So that's something where I don't quite share his optimism that it's all about social freedom sort of happening all on its own. And I mean, I'm not quite sure what kind of Marxist criticism of Rahel Yegi's work the person who asked the question here was thinking about, but I mean, this account of critiques of life world, there's a sort of, I mean, there are many very interesting aspects there, but there's a sort of a similar lack of attention to the really hard fights and clashes that can also happen. I mean, it sounds more like, okay, we live in these different life worlds, and can we critique them, and can people accept these critiques? So it's, again, it's a very sort of discursive picture. It's all about arguments that people exchange. And I mean, it wants to be a political account, of course, but the aspect of politics that it's really about conflicts, about, okay, if capital gets more, labor gets less, and we need to find a way of making sure that capital gets less and labor gets more, that kind of very basic, you know, kind of struggle, that seems to be a bit missing. But I'm not sure whether Rahel would accept my characterization, and I know that she's very interested in democratizing work as well. So maybe this is something she would actually accept and just say that, okay, in that book I didn't focus so much on that. I can ask her maybe next time I see her. But I think one needs to be really aware that, you know, you don't get the kind of modern economic system that can be potentially quite productive without conflicts. And unless you have really strict regulation, those conflicts are going to be at the costs of the weaker parties. And that's what's so problematic about it.
Thank you, Lisa. Ricardo also would like to ask a question. Ricardo, you are on mute. You need to enable your microphone also. We have our difficulties with technology. Yeah, now it's great. Perfect.
You're still muted.
Mute again. I'm sorry. I don't know. I think it's a Teams issue. You are on mute. You need to enable your microphone.
Oh, now it's okay. Now you are hearing me.
Yes.
So sorry, I was just explaining that I have two screens and I have always difficult to find where my cursor is. So thank you very much, Lisa, for your very interesting presentation. I have actually a question that I think dialogues with this last one. So let me put this way. I'm not quite convinced that Honneth does have an harmonic view of the market. I mean, if he pretends that have the assumption that the market has a normative principle that is important for one's self-realization, one's social freedom. I don't think that this premise implies that you are assuming a market without conflict, are harmonious. So, I mean, couldn't we, in a certain way, agree with Honneth that there is a normative principle in the market, or you wouldn't accept that? You would say that market is something that we only have the option of taming it, but externally, I mean, even in this model of the corporation, what is the principle of this formation of the corporation? It is internal of the market. So does the market has a normative principle for you or not? That's the question to sum it up.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
You. Yes and no. And let me try to explain how I see this here. So what Honneth focuses on is this possibility of mutually sort of reinforcing sets of interests. I mean, it's this idea, okay, I don't know, you produce shoes, I produce cheese, you need cheese, I need shoes, we swap. Nice. I mean, that's one aspect of markets. The thing is, you're not the only shoemaker, I'm not the only cheesemaker. There's competition. And competition is the sort of dark side of markets, which Hegel was very much aware of. But if you want to give people certain freedoms, for example, the freedom to choose their profession, to choose to be a shoemaker or a cheesemaker or whatever, then competition is sort of unavoidable. I mean, it's a little bit like, this is not quite an appropriate example, but I'll just make the analogy and you'll see why there are still differences. If you want people to have the freedom to marry whom they like, there might be very unhappy people who lose out because they don't get the marriage partner that they want. And a little bit, I mean, of course, this is more complicated, but it's a little bit like this in markets in the sense that when you have these happy meetings between the shoemaker and the cheesemaker, there are all the other shoemakers and cheesemakers that might lose out. And the story that Adam Smith tell and the economists tell is that, well, it is because of the competition that markets are so efficient, because the shoemaker really has to try very hard to be the best shoemaker, and the cheesemaker the same, and then the other side gets a good offer. So it's sort of the normative principle that there should be mutually beneficial exchanges. That's nice, but it comes hand in hand with the problem of competition. And competition needs to be reined in, because otherwise it drives people to potentially very immoral strategies. And I mean, we know all about, pollution and, harming competitors and so on. So I think unless by markets you mean something that doesn't have competition, but that would be a strange use of the word, wouldn't it? I mean, usually when we say market, there is some element of competition there. And that's, I think, where this conflict element and this element of potentially sliding down into problematic practices, that needs a lot of regulation, because otherwise you don't get the space for for these few happy encounters to take place at all. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes. Actually, the only point that for me was not complained in the not contained, sorry, in the answer is the performance principle. I mean the Leistungsprincip. Honneth argues that in market you have this performance principle, and for that reason you could see certain normativity in the market. So at least is that that is the way that I read Honneth. I don't know. Do you, let's say, buy this performance principle? Do you think that that's reasonable to think that you can have a principle of social freedom building on this principle, this performance principle? That's the point.
Okay, okay, yeah, sorry, I should go back and reread Hegel's Honneth's, probably also Hegel's, but Honneth's text to see how exactly he connects the achievement principle and social freedom. I always saw the point about social freedom as central for his account of markets, not so much the achievement principle. And maybe I read him in that way because I do not at all buy the achievement principle in a sense, because I think real life, I mean, as a normative ideal, it's either empty or unachievable. It's empty because in a way, very often it's sort of, that's not what Honneth wants, but often it gets turned into whoever wins deserves to win. And that's not true, because the starting conditions are often very unfair. And also on the way, I mean, there are all the discrimination that minorities and women and so on face, for example. That's just sort of, it's very dangerous to say the successful ones somehow have achieved something and that's why they deserve to win. or it's sort of an empty ideal, because if you start to actually think about, okay, what is it that they achieve, and is that really something that they can be held responsible for? Then you come, okay, they somehow worked hard, but that's because they were brought up by parents who told them to work hard. They can't be responsible for that. They really made an effort. Well, but so if you start really thinking about, okay, what is it that people can be held responsible for? I think in the end, if you really go down all the arguments, very, very little, if anything at all, remains. Because in a way, we are really sort of, it's our circumstances that influence to a great extent to how much we are able to play by the rules of the game. Now, having said this, I think there's one sense in which one can make sense of this achievement principle, but that's a very sort of reduced and pragmatic sense, and that has nothing at all to do with sort of deep moral principles. And that's something like, okay, you have a position for a surgeon in a hospital and you want to fill it, and you have 5 applicants, and you want the applicant who has the best skills as a surgeon to fill that role. So I think there can be sort of a functional understanding of achievement, which is both backwards looking but also sort of forward looking. If you have a candidate who was a great surgeon in the past, but for some reason we know he will not be a good surgeon in the future, that person shouldn't get the job. So I think we can, within institutions that are meaningful and that have a point and so on, we can, and I'm assuming that hospitals, have a point, and that the role of the surgeon has a point, we can then tell a story about why it's reasonable and it can be justified to choose the candidate who is the best fit for the position. But I would not at all see this as a kind of deep, sort of normative, basic principle of our societies. I think it has been totally overblown. It has sometimes been used to justify inequalities in a way that I find completely indefensible. And that's why I'm very skeptical about this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I'd like to forward you a question that was made on the chat by Gustavo Cunha. It's a very interesting question, but it's a very long one too. So I'd like to, I recommend you to read it, the written question, while I read it aloud. If you can just follow it on the chat. It's Gustavo Cunha from UFSC, Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. So his question, he thanks you for the very interesting talk, and he says regarding what you call the sociological perspective on Hegel and the need for corporations as a sort of boundary for the individual search for recognition, it still leaves open the question of why does solidarity ties people together beyond the workplace? As you actually very well know, Durkheim's argument for organic solidarity deals precisely with this social or sociological dimension. But for him, corporations are the medium through which organic solidarity appears as a normative horizon of interdependence and mutual acknowledgement. Do you see it somehow connected to Hegel's sociological insights, and how? So this is the first question. There are 2 more in the same comment. So the second one would be, and how do you see it, if you do? How do you see a possible connection with a search for recognition within the division of labor? And finally, a non-related question to those above, in a political economic context where many of us see that we do need to save the world of labor, how should neoliberal forms of deregulation and atomization be challenged if work itself has become so individualized through digital platforms and so on? That's the 3 questions.
Yeah, thank you, Gustavo. Those are excellent questions. So I'll try to cover these various aspects, and I think I should anticipate that I keep thinking about that last question, and it bugs me, and I wish I had a good answer, but I'll get to that. So, yes, so in Hegel, the corporations are not as such the institutions that create solidarity between all members of society. I agree with that, and I think that's why they are in this particular place in the philosophy of right, where the transition is then made to the political state. And actually, it's quite interesting that in the later part, in the part on the state, when he talks about political representation, I mean, he's not a Democrat and all, he's a monarch, but he has an understanding of the corporations also being part of the political representation of individuals. So the way he seems to imagine this is that somehow through the corporation, people are then tied into these wider spheres of solidarity in the political realm. And I mean, he has these other, from today's perspective, somewhat problematic views about how, war is an opportunity for people to feel solidarity with all their fellow citizens. And this is then all taking place in the political realm, and the corporations can't do that. Now, if you want to connect this to Durkheim, and I mean, Durkheim has this notion of organic solidarity, which arises between people who actually do different things, but who can see each other as sort of complementary. And I think in a way that's sort of a different picture than the Hegelian one, because the Hegelian one, if you look at the corporations, that's people who do similar things together, who are, sort of forming what in Durkheim would be mechanic solidarity because of similar experiences, similarity in outlook, activities, and so on. So the kind of solidarity that Durkheim calls organic, which happens between different people doing different things, that would be kind of the solidarity between the cheesemaker and the shoemaker, who see, oh, we can actually be useful to each other. And so I think that if one wants to try to combine these two pictures, you have the Hegelian kind of solidarity among colleagues, as it were, and then whenever someone from the corporation is in touch with someone outside, for example, a supplier. So the shoemaker's corporation needs to buy input, I don't know, leather or whatever, or maybe they can make vegan shoes, I don't know. Or when they then sell the shoes to their customers, that's when this other kind of solidarity that recognizes, oh, you're doing something different, but we're actually mutually not only compatible, but mutually sort of we can support each other. That's when that kind of solidarity, I think, then has its place. And I mean, as I wrote in the one paper on Durkheim, a little noted dimension of Durkheim's notion of solidarity is that he says this can only happen if inequality in society is kept under control, because if there's too much inequality, then all these relationships between different people will be marred by inequalities of power and dependence, and then people don't see this as a question of mutuality any longer. Then it's just about pressure. And I mean, you could also say something about competition here and so on, but basically inequality disturbs this picture that different people can see their complementarities, and the solidarity can grow out of that. So that's how I would see these two forms of solidarity here hanging together. And now then the last question, digital work. Now, we had a conference last year when there could still be conferences in person, and it was on solidarity at work. And it so happened, it was just a coincidence, that we had two papers behind each other, which really, for me, made this problem very vivid. So one was about 19th century miners in a mining region. It was a comparison between France and German situation, but actually pretty similar. These people live in the same place. Then they go to work together. They have a common enemy, their employer. They have the same shared experiences. They share their free time activities. It was a lot about football and how football was important for these people. And they share a lifestyle. And so in a way, it's very easy to imagine how these people would start to join forces, organize themselves, and start a struggle for better labor conditions. Because there are all these factors of shared experience, shared spaces, and so on. And then the next paper, after that paper, was on freelance translators, it was a Polish case study, who have Facebook groups where they support each other. And the researcher who did this was doing a sort of ethnographic study, and she also called it solidarity, but it was obviously a very different kind of solidarity. It was these freelancers who sometimes also competed for jobs, but I mean, apparently they were doing pretty specialized translations, so they were on the privileged end, let's say. They would ask questions on a Facebook group, like, how do you translate this very specific term? Or, oh gosh, I have to finish something by midnight, send some good wishes, send some good vibes. These kinds of posts that are, very typical for social media. And then others would respond, and it was all very friendly and cheerful, but it was not at all the kind of shared experience out of which you'd expect a political struggle to happen. And I think that's really one of the big challenges. And I think, if there's going to be more home office during and maybe after Corona, there's also a huge question: where can people encounter each other and build the kinds of relationship of trust that would then enable them to take risks together? Because, struggling for labor rights is always taking risks. And, if there are only 3 people joining, then three people are likely to be just dismissed or silenced, and everyone else will just continue as before. So you need these ties of solidarity and trust. And I really wonder how they can be built when so much communication is just taking place online. I don't think it's impossible, but I think one really needs to think very hard about new strategies. I've seen various ethnographic studies about platform work. And I think on a political level, one really needs something like a right to a physical workplace, not in order to just be there, but to meet colleagues in person. Because otherwise, the employers can really have a very effective divide et impera strategy. Just keep everyone in their home office. They will never meet each other. They will never gather to, just fight for something together. So I think that is a real challenge that we need to take seriously. Fortunately, not all workplaces are completely digital, and maybe those in less digitalized workplaces can also, try to be supportive of some others. But I think it's a huge challenge. I wish I had better answers, but at this point, I'm still struggling with this question.
Thank you, Lisa. I will hand over to Emmanuel Nakamura, who also would like to ask you a question.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. I would like to read something from your paper. Just a moment. Hegel, page 153, 154. Hegel shows a clear sense of the degree to which individuals are influenced by their social background, arguing that the different social classes all have a specific character. The member of the agricultural class, although not untouched by modern development, such as the introduction of civil law, are shaped by their mode of subsistence and develop the substantial disposition of an immediate ethical life based on the family relationship and on trust. I was reading a few weeks ago, maybe you know the book from Melinda Cooper's Family Values. And in this book, she describes the alliance between the neoliberalism and the conservative thought, and how this alliance replaced the welfare social institutions with protections based on family relationships. So my question, Do you think it is possible to find elements in Hegel's philosophy of right to criticize this conservative neoliberal alliance? Or do you think that Hegel's social theory is in this regard, so that Hegel's social theory can no longer be actualized?
Yeah, thank you. That's an interesting connection. I mean, in a way, Hegel is extremely traditionalist here, and he's sort of, derisive. Oh, these, these peasants, they don't want to live up to modern reason. They just stay embedded. There's no awakening of subjectivity in this realm. And I always felt that this is sort of a more difficult part from a modern perspective in Hegel. What do we do with this claim that there are all these people and somehow they don't want to be modern, something like that? It sounds sort of very dismissive. But what is, of course, a correct sociological observation that we can probably still take from him is, not all social milieus are open to the same extent to the kinds of, modernist, or he would say reasonable, but this term is of course super loaded, but sort of to the kinds of arguments about individual freedom, the modern state, the superseding of family relations. And maybe, we moderns have been a little bit too quick to assume that everyone wants to be modern, everyone wants to be individualistic, forgetting that, okay, there might, for whatever reason, and that's a separate question, but there might be parts of the population that might actually, not share the set of values. And I don't think we can find in Hegel any kind of account of how these people would then have a coalition. I mean, one could maybe, come up with an argument, but I'm not sure it would really hold up to say, okay, the rural classes, they are of course also sort of accepting the feudal lords and sort of the very unequal, inegalitarian, unfree relations of rural life as Hegel imagined it. And so in that sense, there is a connection to what we today would describe as sort of capitalists who are basically acting in a sort of feudal way because they're taking what should be public power and it becomes a form of private power. So maybe one could say that Hegel also, in his description of the agricultural class, sort of suggests that they don't really take on all the institutions of the modern state. For example, it's as you said, it's all based on family relations. It's not accepting many of the modern institutions of the state and so on. But I mean, there are 200 years of intellectual history since then, and I think what's so distinctively neoliberal today, that's something I'm not sure he could really imagine, that kind of complete, market freedom. I mean, he had read about Smith and Ricardo, but whenever he talks about this idea that you should let everything free, he immediately says, well, this can't go well, don't do this. So I think he was also, I mean, if you think about his own experiences, he was still very much experiencing a kind of market that was already doing some of its, problematic work, but that was not the kind of absolutized, complete vision of everything being a market that the neoliberalism in the modern form has. I think, I mean, if you want to ask what can we take from Hegel in that respect, I mean, maybe, the notion of Bildung could be one starting point, in the sense that democratic citizens need to be formed and brought up and build the kind of democratic character that he imagined for the other classes. I mean, he's sort of, he was the son of a civil servant, and sometimes I think it shows a little bit. He's full of praise for civil servants and doesn't see that they might also, become quite bureaucratic or technocratic. He thinks civil servants embody reason. But what matters for him is that these people accept the principle of the modern state, the various freedoms that come with it, and sort of act on its principles in their various roles in the different social spheres. And that presupposes certain attitudes and a certain degree of education. And if large parts of the population don't get that kind of education, then we shouldn't be surprised that they don't share the principles of the Hegelian modern state, or of certain progressive principles. And then the alternative is that you fall back into other patterns of family ties or whatever. And of course, it's a catastrophe from the perspective of subjective freedom, if you want to use the Hegelian term, especially, of course, for women, because the traditional family role is then, Hegel wasn't better on that. But if you want to be a modern Hegelian, you can, I think, be a gender egalitarian Hegelian. But what these people today are doing is sort of falling back into gender stereotypes as Hegel saw them in his time, and that's a very, dangerous alliance, I think. So, yeah, I'm not sure how much we can get really out of Hegel, but the focus on Bildung and the question of how this could be achieved could be one starting point, I think. Do you have other suggestions for what you would want to take from Hegel there?
No, I think it is, yes, it is a difficult point to, I just thought it was very interesting how Melinda Cooper's shows this alliance between neoliberal market relationships and families, and it is so different from what Hegel see also as family values in the philosophy of right. And
I was co-teaching Locke the other day, and if you read the second treatise, the first chapters, that's sort of the vision that you get. I mean, I haven't read the Cooper book, but I've heard a little bit about it. I mean, the Lockean vision, the paterfamilias, is the household is the unit, and the father is the little king, and the citizens are sort of equal, but in the family, it's strictly hierarchical. And that combined with a rejection of any state regulation and the idea that, the market forms sort of naturally because we mix our labor with the crown. I think that it's a very agrarian and a very market-friendly vision. And I think, I don't know to what extent Hegel was actually familiar with the second treatise by Locke. I've never seen, does anyone know if there's anything known about this? I'm not sure, but I mean, his vision is completely different. So that would be maybe an interesting contrast here to compare the Locke of the second treatise, including all the post-colonial critique that has been made of that, and the Hegelian vision. And then, of course, there's also post-colonial critiques of that, but those are really very different and very strictly opposed visions of society that you find there.
Yes, thanks. Yes, thanks, Lisa.
Manu, we have a few more questions from the chat. I don't know, maybe I can read it. So I have one question from Vera or Vera. I don't know how to pronounce it. Her question it's about which would be your point of view regarding a certain interpretation from Hegelian corporations, according to which they would be closer to pluralist associations and not necessarily or exclusively work-related. And then she says, like, Vivek, for example, reads Hegel's corporations in this pluralist sense. So which would be your point of view regarding this issue?
I have quite big sympathies for such a reading. I have also certain sort of sociological or empirically founded concerns about it, in the sense that if our society is organized such that people have to spend 8 hours or more at work, then, I mean, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, then how much time and energy is there that people can spend in other kinds of spaces, and this sort of on this more pluralistic picture? And I think, you know, if we had, I don't know, a 15-hour work week, as John Maynard Keynes imagined we would have it, then people would have, you know, lots of possibilities of interacting with others in various kinds of associations. But given that we are in a situation in which work is very central for many people, I mean, the colleagues that you see in, I mean, not during Corona, but I mean, in before Corona, and hopefully at some point after Corona, your colleagues are really the people sometimes you spend more time with them than with your family members. And so I think those social relations need to be crucial among the various relations that can take on the functions of the Hegelian corporations. And what I would not want to see is a kind of reading where these other kinds of associations would sort of replace what happens at the workplace. So democratic workplaces together with other associations, yes, please. But I think it would be dangerous to say, oh, forget about the workplace, that's just a capitalist institution and we can't do anything about it anyway. Let's focus on other kinds of associations. I think we need to sort of really keep the workplace in mind and think about the centrality it has for most people. And if there's no reforms at that level, then I find it very hard to imagine how other associations on their own would bring about all the reforms that we would want to see and take on all the functions that Hegel sees in the corporations.
Thanks, Lisa, for the answer. And Inácio would like to ask you a question. I will hand over to Inácio.
Thank you for your presentation. I would like to talk a little about public opinion. Currently, the role of marketing is important in forming preference. It is very important in the economy. What is your view on the role of the formation of public opinion in Hegel on consumer preference? Can corporation and the policy make any contribution in this context?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think, in a way, in the paper, I didn't deal with it because in Hegel's time, there was no marketing and there was no advertisement. I mean, I've actually, when I was working on this paper, I started reading about the history of advertisement to check whether it was already happening at Hegel's time. But from what I've read from historians, it started only later. So that's a difference between Hegel's time and ours. And another difference is that, of course, he is not a believer in representative democracy. And so in a sense, for him, public opinion plays a much more limited role for government than we will say today, because for him it's much more important that the monarch and, you know, benevolent civil servants and then the representation of the corporations, these kinds of institutions do a good job. And public opinion doesn't have the kind of normative weight for him that one would see if one adopts, for example, a sort of Habermasian or Laclos-Mouffe perspective on, okay, public opinion really shapes and should shape democratic politics. So in that sense, I don't think we can get so much out of Hegel himself. But of course, the question is a very legitimate one. Well, what does it mean for today? I mean, if you just ask me about, okay, what is my view on advertisement and PR and all these things, I would just say, okay, that's one of the areas where we really need massive market regulation. Because in a way, what we see today in many areas is that markets are very efficient at satisfying the preferences that they create in the first place. So it's a sort of empty circle. It has nothing to do with people's genuine preferences, because what they want is already constructed by market players, and then they say, oh, we are so good at fulfilling people's preferences, but that's just because they've created those preferences in the first place. So I think one has to be really careful here. And I mean, just as an aside, I'm currently also working on this argument that markets are so good in dealing with decentralized knowledge, this big defense by Hayek and others. Markets are these knowledge machines, as it were. It doesn't quite work if the knowledge is all about manufactured preferences and all sort of mediated through advertisement. What kind of knowledge is that markets are dealing with? It's all artificial, and it's not really normatively valuable as such. I mean, if I desire, I don't know, I don't drink this stuff, but Pepsi over Cola or whatever, is that a valuable kind of information that a market should process? But that's a huge topic, I think, on its own. Nonetheless, I think that one shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the influence of advertisement on people is also in turn influenced by their social environment. And I mean, in some social contexts, people are ridiculed if they follow the latest, if they buy the latest gadgets or follow the latest trends, and then they don't do it. In certain countercultures, there's a very, functional resistance to advertisement. And I think in other cultural milieus, it's attention to certain kinds of advertisement. And I think so it's never, we shouldn't have the kind of picture where consumers are just sort of passive playthings and the corporations put advertisement out there and then, it's a blind herd of sheep just following. I think the social context does have a certain role on people. And of course, some social contexts are such that they encourage people to be very consumerist. And they actually encourage people to always go for the latest gadget. And I mean, I think this passage from Hegel that I mentioned about the individual is not part of a corporation, in that sense that people who don't have a sort of stable environment where they receive recognition from others, then those individuals might be particularly sort of vulnerable for advertisement for material goods, because that advertisement promises them that they will feel good and feel valuable and feel appreciated if they buy certain goods. And there's sort of a pseudo replacement for really human interaction. I get this new gadget and then others will recognize me. I think that there's something true about that, and if you think about the psychological mechanisms. So I think the social environment still plays a role, and I think from a democratic perspective, a good democratic Bildung or formation would also give people a healthy dose of skepticism towards the promises of advertisement. But I think this is also an area where there should just be really strict regulation of what companies can advertise, how they can advertise, especially towards children. I mean, those are the most vulnerable consumers. But also in general, I think it's sort of not worthy of a democratic society to let its public space be completely filled up with advertisement for stupid consumer goods. I mean, this is sort of, we should have better ways of filling our public spaces. But yeah, that's not where we currently are. Do we still have a connection?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Yeah. I hope you still have breath for one more question. We have one more question from the chat, and then we'll head towards the end of this first seminar. So the last question is from Ranieri Garcia, and he asks how these two Hegelian models of taming markets can be actualized or even applied in this context of financiarization or maybe financialization.
Yeah, thank you. That's a difficult one, because I think both mechanisms have completely failed in the financial world, and this is one of the areas where markets have been most disembedded, and where the belief that markets shouldn't be regulated has actually been strongest. So, I mean, it depends a bit on which phenomena exactly you mean by financialization. On the one hand, there's the sort of the power of financial markets and their influence on the rest of the economy. On the other hand, there is also some people mean by financialization that financial incentives are introduced in areas such as healthcare or education or whatever. And I think one should ideally treat those a little bit separately, but I'll just, for now, for the sake of time, I'll keep them together. I think the external regulation of financial markets and of their impact on other areas of life. I mean, we had the big crisis in 2008, and since then there has been talk of, okay, we need stricter regulations, and very little has actually happened. And I think the explanation is that the lobbying power of financial institutions on the political system is actually extremely strong. And that means that in that area, it's sort of a more Marxist reality where the state really doesn't have the kind of counterpower to regulate these kinds of entities. And in terms of corporations or anything like that, if the social environment of these people, bankers, traders, and so on, is basically you're the best person to earn most money, then this is a sort of anti-Hegelian socialization, because it's a socialization that tries people to do exactly what Hegel says only happens to the person who doesn't have any kind of social environment. But that was very much, in a way, what happened there. And at the same time, there was a sort of normative story about how financial markets did a lot of good to society, and therefore all the striving for gains was actually legitimized. So people also had a sort of moral absolution from any kinds of restrictions. So they went into this mode of unlimited greed forevermore, which, as I said earlier, for Hegel was really a kind of pathology. So I wrote a paper once arguing that, well, if you want to do something about this, and if you want to, put responsibility onto bankers, what you'd have to do is make them financially liable for all the harm that they might do if there's another financial crisis. So, force them to put, I don't know, 50% of their salary into some kind of institution, and they only get it back 10 years later, after taxes, of course, if there had been no financial crisis, because then they would really, feel the responsibility. Now, this is very crude, of course, and you have to think about the details. But the problem is that these people don't personally feel the negative impact of their activities, but can externalize those onto others or taxpayers when a bank gets bailed out because it's too big to fail. And that, in a way, is not what those who defend markets like Smith or Ricardo thought markets would be like. They thought in markets, everyone has to carry the responsibility for the consequences of their actions. But our financial system is so complex that we don't have this nexus between action and liability any longer. And that
You were frozen for a minute, for a few seconds.
Should I repeat something, or was it still?
Yeah, just the last part.
I just said at the end, it's sort of a toxic mixture. It calls itself free markets, but they're actually very feudal structures and state capture and so on. So it's not at all what a benign market could ever be. It's one could really question the use of the term market for the financial system we have at the moment. There are some features of markets there, but there are also many other features that are actually not at all like markets. And so I think there's a lot that needs to be re-regulated there.
Right, Lisa, thank you so much for answering all our questions and considering the time frame limitation we have. We now have to head towards the end of this first seminar. In behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like once again to thank Professor Lisa Herzog for joining us here today and for the great exposition. And I also would like to thank our colleagues that joined us per Teams, per Facebook, and we appreciate the many questions that have been made. Before we leave, I'd like to thank also our technical team of Unicinos who helped us to organize this event through the platform teams, who also are in the backstage here with us, Andressa, Fernando, also Diego and Samuel, who help us with the airing of this transmission through Facebook. And I'd like to remind everyone that we will also make this video available very soon on our YouTube channel, and we will also add Portuguese subtitles to it. Also, don't forget to check out the webpage with information to our next seminars. I hope to see you again next time, and I'd like to give the floor to my colleagues if they want to say goodbye to our attendees.
And I should add thanks to Poliana, who's made all this possible, I think, together with others. So thank you to you as well.
Thank you.
So I would only like to thank you again, Lisa, very much. It was a very interesting debate, amazing lecture, and we hope that maybe in a post-coronavirus scenario, we could welcome you here in Brazil, maybe in Campinas, maybe in Brasilia, or maybe in Porto Alegre. Let's hope for that. Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, I just want to thank you, Lisa and Poliana, for the organization, and I also would like to thank you, Andressa and Fernando, for the technical support. I think it is all, and also remember that in October, we will have Norbert Vatek as guest, and then in November, Frank Huda, and in December, Paul Arantes. Yes.
Inácio had to leave us, so he wishes also, he would like to thank for Lisa exposition, and I would now finish then this transmission and thank my colleagues, thank Lisa for this first seminar.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.